The jar of preserved plums had been on Mara Dolan's windowsill since September. She had put it there when she moved into the room above the laundry, the room that was 8 feet by 10 feet and contained a cot, a washstand, a small stove, and the window, because the plums were from her garden, the last of what she had put up before the house was sold. And the jar was the one thing she had carried from the old life that still smelled like what the old life had been. She had not eaten the plums. She had not been able to open the jar. She had looked at it every morning and every evening, and had told herself she would open it when she was ready, and had not yet been ready. It was February. She had moved in September. The jar sat on the windowsill in the thin winter light, and Mara sat on the cot and looked at it. And the room was the size it had always been, and she was the size she had always been. And neither of these things showed any sign of changing. She picked up the jar. She turned it over in her hands, the familiar weight of it, the dark fruit visible through the glass, the wax seal her own hands had pressed down in August, when the garden was still hers and the life was still shaped the way she had understood it to be shaped. Then she set it back on the windowsill and put on her coat and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Holt whether anyone in Bear Creek Ridge was hiring. If something in you just recognized that window, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches tonight. Because what Mara Dolan does when she finally opens that jar, and what a man on a mountain says when she tells him what's inside it, will change the way you think about what grief is for and what it becomes when someone finally has room for it. Her husband had died in June. Not unexpectedly. Thomas Dolan had been ill since the previous winter, a slow and certain kind of ill that gave them time to prepare and no mercy about what the preparation felt like. He had been 41 years old and a carpenter in Bear Creek Ridge, and a man of steady and uncomplicated goodness, the kind of man who was not remarkable in any way, that made stories, and who was, in the absence of stories, simply the person you came home to, and the reason home meant what it meant. Mara was 38 years old and had been large her whole life, full-figured in the substantial way of a woman who had done real physical work since girlhood, and who occupied her share of space with the unself-conscious solidity of someone who had never once considered it wasn't hers to occupy. She had dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that were her husband's favorite thing about her, which he had told her precisely once, on their wedding night, and which she had held on to with the tenacity of a woman who understands that some things are said exactly once and mean exactly what they say. She had loved Thomas Dolan for 14 years and had lost him in June, and had discovered, in the months after, that grief is not a feeling that lives in the chest where everyone says it lives. It is a physical condition. It occupies space. It requires more room than is ever available, which was why the 8 by 10 room above the laundry had been, since September, insufficient. The house went to Thomas's brother, which was the provision of the will and which had cost her nothing except everything. She had packed her trunk, taken the jar of plums from the last shelf, and moved into the one room she could afford on her wages, the keeping of accounts, which had always been her work. She had a clear head for numbers and had been doing the books for the Bear Creek Ridge General Store and the land office since before Thomas died. She had continued after. It was Hopper, the land office clerk, thin, amiable, wearing the same green waistcoat every day regardless of season, who told her about the Rourke Ranch in January. Caleb Rourke, Hopper said, initialing a deed. Rancher, 8 miles up the North Ridge. His wife passed 3 years ago. He came in asking if I knew anyone who could keep books and manage a household. He looked up. I told him I might. I live above the laundry, Mara said. I have one room. I know, Hopper said. That's why I'm mentioning it." She thought about it for 3 days. The hesitation was not about the work or the isolation. She understood isolation in its most concentrated form. It was about what it meant to take the position, to pack the trunk again, to move back into a life of larger dimensions after she had spent 5 months compressing herself into the smallest possible space, as though compression were a form of respect for the dead. She was not sure it was. She was also not sure it wasn't. On the 4th day, she put the jar of plums in her coat pocket and told Hopper she would take the position. The wagon driver who brought her up the mountain road was a silent man named Grubb, who had prepared for her presence by developing no opinion about it either way, which she found restful. "He doesn't say much," Grubb said when the ranch came into view. "Neither do I," Mara said. Caleb Rourke met her at the gate. He was a large man, not heavy, but built for endurance, wide through the shoulder with the weathered, economical quality of a man who had been alone long enough that his body had stopped making social effort and was simply what it was. He had dark hair going gray and a beard that had been recently trimmed. She noticed that, the recent trimming, and understood it as the gesture of a man who had prepared for her arrival and would not say so. He looked at her the way he apparently looked at most things, directly, without the social softening that most people applied to first looks, arriving at whatever conclusion he arrived at and keeping it to himself. "Mara Dolan," she said. "Caleb Rourke." He looked at her trunk. "One?" "One," she said. He carried it inside. The house was large and cold in the specific way of a house that has been heated by one person's worth of habit. The rooms he used were warm enough. The rooms he didn't were not. The kitchen was the first kind. It was a good kitchen, well equipped, with a stove that had been recently blacked and a larder that was adequately stocked. And it smelled of coffee and the particular neutral smell of a space where food is made and eaten without occasion. He showed her the kitchen, the pantry, the accounts room, and the sleeping room off the back that would be hers. He explained his schedule and his requirements in approximately 30 words, which she counted with the automatic precision of a woman who had spent 20 years listening carefully to men who used few words and learning that few words contained more than many. "The accounts are in the back room," he said. "They're behind." "How far behind?" she said. He considered this. "Some months," he said. She had understood from the land office that some months meant quite a few months. She did not say so. She said, "I'll start tomorrow." He nodded and went outside. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment and looked at the window. A good window, south-facing, with the mountain visible through it in the February cold. She took the jar of plums out of her coat pocket and set it on the windowsill. It looked better there than it had in the 8x10 room. The light was different on this side of the mountain. She went to set up the sleeping room. The accounts were 4 months behind, which was not as far as she had feared and further than he had implied, which was consistent with a man who did not dramatize his difficulties. She had them current in 9 days, working mornings before the household demands required her, and evenings after the supper, things were cleared. The work was satisfying in the particular way that bringing order to disorder is always satisfying. The numbers finding their proper relationships, the ledger pages filling in the clear, even hand she had been praised for, since she was 12 years old keeping her father's books in a dry goods store in Billings. On the 3rd day, a boy appeared. He came from the barn. She had not known there was a boy, and he stood in the kitchen doorway in the manner of someone who has been living in a house long enough to be comfortable in it and who has been told someone new is here and has come to conduct his own assessment. He was 9 years old, brown-haired, with his father's directness and the particular self-possession of a child who has been left largely to manage himself. "I'm Eli," he said. "Papa said you're the new housekeeper." "I'm the new housekeeper," Mara said. "Are you going to stay?" he said. Mara thought about this. "For as long as the work is here," she said. Eli looked at this answer. "The last one didn't stay," he said. "Why not?" "She didn't like it quiet," he said. "She said it was too lonely." Mara turned back to the stove. "I don't mind quiet," she said. "Do you eat oatmeal?" "I don't like oatmeal," he said. "Tell me what you like, and I'll see what I can do about it." He told her. She did what she could about it. By the end of the week, he was appearing in the kitchen doorway before the morning work was finished. And by the end of the second week, he was sitting at the table while she cooked, either approval or the behavior of a boy who had been eating alone for 3 years and had not realized how much he minded it until someone gave him an alternative. Caleb noticed on the 10th day. He came in for the accounts question he had been bringing her each morning, found Eli at the table with cornbread and a look of focused contentment, stood in the doorway a moment longer than the question required. He said nothing. He asked his question and went back to the cattle. That evening, he left a good-sized piece of pine on the back step, not firewood, but a piece selected for its grain for making something. She left it where it was. In the morning, it was gone, and in the evening of the following day, there was a small shelf mounted to the wall beside the kitchen window, at exactly the right height to hold a jar of preserved plums where the light would reach it. She noted the shelf. She noted that he had looked at the window enough to know the jar was there. She noted what it meant that he had put the shelf where the light was. She left the jar on the windowsill. She was not yet ready. In the 3rd week, she began to talk to him at supper. Not about anything large, about the accounts, the cattle numbers, the provision schedule. Brief, specific, useful. The conversations lasted slightly longer each evening. On the 18th day, they worked through a drainage problem in the east pasture together and arrived at a solution neither of them had separately. And he sat with that for a moment and said, "Good." She had not heard that word directed at her work since Thomas. She cleared the supper things and said good night. In her room, she sat with the weight of that good and understood that she was somewhere between not ready and ready. And she took the jar of plums from her coat pocket. She had been moving it from surface to surface since the first day, and set it on the shelf. It was a Sunday in late February when the snow came without warning and kept them both inside all day, which was the kind of day that happened on the mountain and that both of them had experience managing alone, but had not managed together before. Eli had been taken to his aunt's the previous day for a week's visit, a standing arrangement that preceded Mara's arrival. And so it was the two of them and the snow and the fire and the long, white, unscheduled hours of a Sunday that had nowhere particular to go. She worked on the accounts in the morning. He repaired harness. By midday, the snow was heavy enough that the barn was barely visible from the kitchen window. And she made soup, and they ate it with the easy silence of two people who had established, over 18 days, that silence between them was not a problem to be solved. In the afternoon, she was reorganizing the provision shelf when she found, behind a tin of salt, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. A piece of woman's needlework, unfinished, with a needle still threaded through it and the thread gone brittle with age. She recognized immediately what it was and what it was not her business to examine. And she was rewrapping it when he came in from the main room and saw her with it. She held it out to him without speaking. He took it. He stood holding it for a moment with the look of a man who has been handed something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him, because sitting across from him seemed like the correct thing to do. And the fire talked, and the snow talked, and the afternoon settled around them with the weight that Sundays have when there is nowhere to be and nothing required. He told her about his wife. Not immediately. It came out slowly, the way things come out when they have been held in a long time and are finding the path of least resistance, which is almost always through a person who is sitting quietly, without asking. Her name had been Ruth. She had been embroidering that piece the week before she was taken sick. He had found it on the third day after she died and had put it on the provision shelf because he could not put it elsewhere and could not throw it away. And every time he found it, he put it back and had been doing that for 3 years. Mara listened. She did not reflect his grief back at him or minimize it or rush toward the resolution of it. She simply held the space that the telling required, which was what she knew how to do and had always known how to do. The same quality she had brought to Thomas's dying. The willingness to stay present in the difficult room without flinching. When he had said what he was going to say, he was quiet for a while, and so was she. Then she said, because the Sunday and the snow and the needlework had made something in her available that she had not expected to be available. I have a jar of plums on the shelf in your kitchen. I put them up in August. I have not been able to open them since June. He looked at the table. Thomas died in June, she said. He liked the plums. She stopped. She had not said this to anyone. She had not been able to say it. Had not, in 5 months above the laundry and 18 days on this mountain, found a room large enough to say it in without the saying of it taking up all the available air. She tried again. I have been in a room that is 8 feet by 10 feet since September. I have been trying to grieve in it. She looked at the window, at the snow making the barn invisible. She's bigger than my cabin, she said. The grief. It is bigger than in any cabin I have been in. Her voice broke on the last word. She had not meant it to break. She had been keeping it steady for 8 months, and it chose this moment, in this kitchen, with this snow, to stop being steady. She did not look at him. She looked at the window and let the break happen because there was nothing else to do. The plums and Thomas eating them off a spoon in the July heat. And the garden no longer hers. And the 8 by 10 room where the grief had been folded into a space designed for a single person's sleep. She heard him. She heard him before she turned. The sound of a man whose composure has been breached by something that reached past all the careful structures he had built to manage it. She turned. He was crying. Not quietly. The kind that comes when it has been held back too long. And the holding apparatus finally gives way. He was crying harder than she had been crying, which was the thing she had not expected. Which was the thing she would think about for the rest of her life. That she had said she's bigger than my cabin, meaning her grief, meaning Thomas and the compressed room and everything she had tried to fit into it. And he had heard her and cried harder, not because he pitied her, because he understood her completely. He had his own grief in an insufficient space, 3 years of it, the size of an unfinished needlework, and a house with the right equipment and the wrong quality, and a boy who appeared in doorways, looking for someone to sit in the kitchen with. She did not move to him. She sat with the crying the way she sat with most difficult things. Present, steady, not rushing toward the end of it. When it had run its course, they were both quiet. The snow was still coming. The fire was still talking. I have a mountain, he said finally. His voice was rough with it. Not a cabin. There is room. She looked at him. For all of it, he said, whatever size it is. She looked at the jar of plums on the shelf in the light. Then she got up and took the jar from the shelf and broke the wax seal and set it on the table between them and sat back down. The spring came late. And when it came, it brought Eli back from his aunt's with 3 weeks of opinions and the energy of a boy relieved to be among people who ate actual food at actual hours. He found his father and Mara at the kitchen table with the accounts and the coffee, and the particular quality of two people who have arrived at an understanding not yet named, but entirely present. "Are you going to stay now?" he said. "Not for as long as the work is here. Just, are you going to stay?" Mara looked at him. Then at Caleb, who was looking at the accounts with the expression of a man waiting to hear what she said. "Yes," she said. Eli nodded, in the manner of a boy whose hypothesis has been confirmed by the data, and went to look for the cornbread. The trouble came in the particular form of the April church social, the gathering at which every family in the valley appeared and at which Caleb Rourke had not appeared in 3 years, but appeared this year with Mara beside him. The social temperature communicated the town's opinion in the first 10 minutes. Not in words. In the specific quality of attention a small community directs at something it is classified as irregular. Mara kept her back straight. Mrs. Alderton was a woman of 60 who had been the social anchor of Bear Creek Ridge for 30 years and who had, in that capacity, developed opinions that carried weight in direct proportion to their rarity. She did not share them often, which meant that when she did, the room listened. She had been watching Mara from across the hall since they arrived, with the steady, gathering attention of a woman arriving at a conclusion. She crossed the hall in the second hour, when the supper tables had been arranged and the families were finding their seats. And she stopped in front of Mara and looked at her for a moment with the directness of a woman who had been looking at people long enough to do it without apology. "You kept Thomas Dolan's accounts," Mrs. Alderton said. "I knew Thomas. Good man." "He was," Mara said. "You've been keeping the Rourke books since February." "I have. Hopper says they're the best-kept accounts in the valley now." Mrs. Alderton paused. She was not a woman who used pauses carelessly. "He also says you restructured the provision schedule and saved Caleb $40 this winter." Mara said nothing. $40, Mrs. Alderton said again. "That's not a housekeeper. That's a partner." She looked at Caleb, who was standing 2 feet away, listening with the stillness of a man who has decided the situation does not require him to intervene. Then she looked back at Mara. "This valley doesn't have enough good bookkeepers. It doesn't have enough sense either. But that's a separate matter." She looked at the room, at the people who had been watching with their careful attention, and said, loudly enough to carry, "The Rourke accounts are the best kept in the valley. Anyone who has questions about what that woman is doing on that mountain can ask me." She went to find her seat. The room recalibrated. Not all at once. Rooms do not recalibrate all at once, but in the progressive way of a social temperature changing, person by person, table by table, as people processed what they had just heard from the one person in the room whose processing was considered authoritative. Caleb looked at Mara. "She's right," he said. "About the partner part." He said it simply, the way he said the things that mattered. Not as a performance, not as a speech, but as a fact being named for the first time in a room where it needed to be named. "I'd like to make it formal, if you're willing." The hall had not gone completely quiet. There was still the sound of the supper tables being laid and the children moving, and the general productive noise of a community gathering. But the people within hearing had heard it, and the people within hearing included Mrs. Alderton, who looked up from arranging her napkin with an expression of a woman who has expedited a conclusion she expected to reach eventually. "I'm willing," Mara said. They were married in June, which was the month that grief had arrived, and which was, Mara had decided, the correct month to put something else in its place. Not over it, not instead of it, but alongside it. the way the living and the dead coexist in a person who has loved well and lost and continued. Eli stood beside his father and was serious about it in the way he was serious about all important matters, which was completely. Hopper came in his green waistcoat, which turned out to be his formal wear as well as his regular wear, which Mara found quietly perfect. The jar of plums had been opened in February, on the Sunday with the snow. She and Caleb had eaten them at the kitchen table with the spoon going back and forth between them, and she had cried again, and he had not. He had simply sat with the crying the way she had sat with his, present and steady, and not rushing toward the end of it. They had tasted of August, of the garden and the old life and everything that had preceded this kitchen and this mountain. They had been, despite everything, exactly what they were supposed to be. That summer she put up new plums from the kitchen garden she had planted in April, twice the number, in twice the jars. She set the first jar in the window where the light reached it, and she did not wait to open it. She had been told, in the particular layered way the world tells large women who are also grieving women who are also women alone, each element compounding the others, that the container available to her was exactly what it appeared to be: small, sufficient for a single life in reduced circumstances. She had compressed herself into it because compression had seemed like respect for the dead. What she had found on the mountain was this: that the responsible thing and the true thing are not always the same thing, and that a grief the size of hers required a space the size of a mountain, and that a man who cried harder when she described her grief was a man who had that kind of space in him and was telling her so in the only language honest enough for the occasion. She had always been bigger than a cabin. She had simply needed a mountain to live up to her.